cloud. Okay, we are recording. And I'm going to open it up to folks. Hello to everyone who's already joined. Thanks for joining us today. Just a quick note, we're going to give folks about 5 minutes to join, and then we'll get underway shortly. Thanks. Okay, the attendance seems to have leveled off a bit, so we'll get underway here. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the first annual tier compliance workshop for the conventional oil and gas sector. My name is Peter Moore. I'm a manager in the industrial climate policy team at Alberta Environment Parks. I'll be joined by John Story-Bischoff, Maggie Scott, and Jason Wang from the Climate Implementation and Compliance branch in delivering the workshop presentation to you today. Next slide, please. Here's our agenda for today. The presentation is a bit lengthy. We have a lot of ground to cover. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please submit those using the Q&A function within the Zoom platform. We'll be answering questions using that feature throughout. We will also be pausing for question periods to catch up and answer questions verbally throughout the presentation. If you're not able to get your question in today, or if you have follow-up questions following the presentation, please submit those to aap.ghg@gov.ab.ca, and we'll respond as quickly as we can. And finally, the PowerPoint deck will be published on the Tier Conventional Oil and Gas website following the workshop. Just a quick run through the agenda. So we'll start with some introductions to the organization. We'll give a bit of a background and regulatory overview. We'll provide some updates on key items related to the aggregate treatment under Tier. We'll take a brief pause to catch up on some questions. Then we'll jump into some reminders and prior year's results and learnings from past compliance reporting periods. We'll give an overview of third-party verification requirements. We'll give an overview of the Alberta greenhouse gas quantification methodologies, specifically Chapter 15, which is the chapter that deals with aggregate facility quantification. We'll take another brief pause to catch up on questions. Then we'll jump into an overview of methods of compliance, including some details on remitting compliance payments and submissions. We'll give an overview of the specified gas reporting regulation requirements. Then we have a brief video walkthrough, which we'll also be making available online that covers the compliance form. Then we'll kind of end things off with some policy updates and ongoing implementation updates for aggregate facilities. And then finally, a review of key dates and deadlines reviews. And then we'll cap things off with a final question period at the end. Next slide, please. So a few key takeaways right off the bat from today's workshop before we dive in. Benchmark and benchmark units will be assigned to each aggregate facility in April 2021, whether or not an application for either of these was received. As a reminder, the person responsible for an aggregate facility must submit a third-party verified compliance report by June 30th, 2021 for the 2020 compliance year. And any required true-up to a facility's compliance obligation, whether that's satisfied using credits or offsets or through tier fund payments, should be completed before submitting the compliance report. And we'll be providing details about how to do that later on in the presentation, as I mentioned. Next slide, please. Start with a bit of an overview of our organizational structure, and some of the units, our working units, focus specifically on the conventional oil and gas sector. Well, within the policy division of Alberta Environment Parks, led by Assistant Deputy Minister Rhonda Golden, there are really two branches that focus on climate change. The first is the org structure pictured here for the Climate Implementation and Compliance branch. Justin Wheeler is the executive director of the branch. There's a number of units reporting to Justin, but perhaps the most relevant to today's conversation is the Climate Change Compliance Unit. That unit is directed by John Story-Bischoff. John has a number of climate change engineers and compliance specialists reporting to him, including Yan Liu, Shan Pletcher, James Chen, Gustavo Hernandez, Maggie Scott, Patrick Forsyth, Rihanna Zhang, Paul Kahana, Anna Miranda Rodriguez, and Lisa Brown. Next slide, please. The second branch is the Air and Climate Policy branch, also reporting to Rhonda Golden. Robert Hamelick is the executive director of the branch. Again, there are a number of units within the branch, but the most relevant to today's conversation is the Industrial Climate Policy branch, which is directed by Sam Ferrillo. Reporting to Sam is myself, Peter Moore, as the conventional oil and gas policy lead, and I also manage the cost containment program under TIER. Reporting to me is Ned Ombufor, who's a climate change engineer on my team. Also on the industrial climate policy team are a number of sector leads, engineers, and policy specialists listed here, including Colin Yan and Dragan Pejic, two of the team engineers supporting the conventional oil and gas file currently. Next, I'll provide some background and a bit of a regulatory overview and some updates. So a bit of history about our regulatory system. Introduced in 2007, the Specified Gas Emitters Regulation was Alberta's first carbon pricing system and focused on regulating emissions from large industrial facilities. It set facility-specific baselines based on historic performance and regulated direct emissions only. Then in 2018, the SGER was replaced by the Carbon Competitiveness Incentive Regulation, which moved to an output-based allocation system using assigned and established benchmarks instead of facility-specific benchmarks. The CCIR incorporated indirect emissions, and it was complemented by a province-wide carbon levy, which led to the allowing of voluntary opt-in for facilities under the mandatory, that fell under the mandatory regulatory emissions threshold. Next slide, please. CCIR was replaced by the tier system starting January 1st, 2020. The tier system incorporates elements of both the SGR and the CCIR. Facilities with 100,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent or more in 2016 or any subsequent year have a mandatory obligation to comply with the regulation. The system also includes a number of voluntary opt-in pathways for facilities under that threshold, including the conventional and gas aggregate facility opt-in pathway. Detailed information about the tier approach is always available on the tier websites. And just a quick reminder that there's one general site for tier and one site specifically dedicated to the conventional and gas sector, since the treatments are a little bit different for the sector under the regulation. Finally, tier is recognized as meeting the federal benchmark requirements as a provincial program under the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act for 2020 and 2021, which means the federal output-based pricing system does not currently apply in Alberta. Bit of an overview of tier. Under the program, facilities must comply with the least stringent of two benchmark options. The first is a facility-specific benchmark option, which is set based on 90% of historical emissions intensity for a facility. For large emitters and regular opted-in facilities, the facility-specific benchmarks are tightened over time, becoming more stringent. However, tightening is not applied to FSBs for aggregate facilities at this time. The second of the benchmark types are high performance benchmarks, which have not currently been implemented for the conventional oil and gas sector. These benchmarks are based on the performance of the best performing facilities for a product. No tightening rate applies to the high performance benchmarks. Regulated emission sources under tier include all direct emissions with accounting for imported heat, hydrogen, and electricity for large emitters and opted-in facilities. It's important to note that for aggregate facilities, only stationary fuel combustion emissions are regulated. Underneath the tier regulation, there are 4 more detailed standards that outline various requirements and processes for the system. I'll get into each of the standards listed here and their intent on the next slide. But it's important to note part 1 of the standards are legally binding under the tier regulation. Part 2 of the standards are also requirements, but not binding under the regulation. Another important document is the Alberta Quantification Methodologies, or the AQM. It provides mandatory quantification requirements for reporting and compliance requirements under the regulation. The AQM is mandatory through the standards. Chapter 15 of the AQM, as I mentioned, and which we'll be discussing in a bit more detail later in the presentation, outlines the quantification requirements specifically for conventional oil and gas facilities and aggregates. And of course, all of these documents are available on the tier website. So I'll jump into a brief overview of each one of the standards. So the first is the standard for developing benchmarks, which provides methodologies for developing facility-specific benchmarks and the methodology behind the high-performance benchmarks. It provides and outlines treatment of indirects and cogeneration and self-generation of electricity in benchmark setting, really more applicable to the large emitter and kind of standard opt-in pathway facilities. It also deals with entry into the regulation through opt-in, as well as the cost containment program. The second of the standards is the standard for completing greenhouse gas compliance and forecasting reports. It outlines facility requirements for reporting and forecasting and provides level requirements for selecting quantification methodologies. The third is the standard for validation, verification, and audit, which outlines requirements for third-party assurance providers like validators and verifiers, as well as auditors. It's applicable to verification of compliance reports, benchmark applications, data submissions, and emission offset project reports. And finally, the fourth standard is the standard for greenhouse gas emission offset project developers, which outlines the requirements for developing emission offset projects. Under tier, each regulated facility must submit an annual compliance report, which must be verified by a qualified third-party verifier. The reports must be submitted by June 30th of this year for the 2020 compliance year. And each report requires a positive verification opinion from a qualified third-party verifier, as I mentioned. And any material errors must be resolved before the submission is made. It's important to note there are a number of differences in compliance report content and requirements for large emitters and regular opted-in facilities versus aggregate facilities. And just to note that a verifier should be aware of these differences when completing a verification for an aggregate facility. As we previously announced and discussed through previous webinars, we've taken a unique approach for aggregate benchmarks and requirements for the 2020 compliance year. For 2020, the default benchmark option is a 2020 based benchmark for 2020 compliance. This effectively means the default compliance obligation for aggregate facilities is a 10% reduction of 2020 stationary fuel combustion emissions. This approach was really taken with a view to reducing administrative burden for the year. As a result of that approach, no benchmark application was required to be submitted for the 2020 compliance year. We did provide an option to submit a benchmark unit application, allowing aggregate facilities to submit an application for a benchmark unit based on publicly reported fuel volumes, and also, if applicable, non-reported fuel volumes as well. If that being said, the standard approach, if no benchmark unit application was received, a representative unit will be assigned by the director based on evaluation of the publicly available data for that aggregate facility. AEP also provided flexibility for aggregate facilities to voluntarily use a 2019 based benchmark for 2020 compliance. Doing so would mean the facility would be subject to an obligation based on a 10% intensity reduction of stationary fuel combustion emissions for 2020 relative to 2019 emissions. This required submission of a third-party verified benchmark application in early 2021. And I guess importantly to note, under any of the aforementioned options, a benchmark and a benchmark unit will be assigned by the director via letter based on an evaluation of applications and or the publicly available data. In cases where additional clarity is required or where assessment of public data may not produce a reasonable result, we will be reaching out to contact the person responsible for a relevant aggregate facility to discuss and work through that. A few updates on recent applications and upcoming assignments. Evaluation of person responsible change applications is now complete. Letters confirming the outcome of that evaluation should have been received. With respect to other aggregate changes and applications for 2021, department-led cleanup of aggregate facilities that we discussed in the fall is now complete. Any changes have been notified by letter. Applications for new aggregates for 2021, revocations and removals for 2021 have also been processed, and confirmation should have been received by letter. And all applications for facility additions to existing aggregates have been processed up to March 1st submissions. And just a quick note that new applications for additions will be processed on an ongoing basis in the order that they are received. With respect to benchmark applications for 2019 baseline usage, review is underway, and we anticipate completion of that in notification in April 2021. And finally, benchmark and benchmark unit assignments for default 2020 baselines for 2020 compliance should also be completed and assigned in April 2021 as well. With that, I think we'll take a few minutes to pause and catch up on some questions.
The queue is clear at the moment, Peter. There were a couple of questions that I think you answered in the last slide in terms of timing of benchmarks being assigned.
Okay, great. Well, then I guess we'll keep moving on. So for the next section, I'll turn it over to you, John, to discuss reminders, prior period results, and learnings.
Thank you, Peter. So as Peter said, we'll go through some of the things that we've learned over the course of SGR and CCIR that may be applicable for folks working under TIER. So this slide just gives a bit of an overview of the results from the prior programs, SGR and CCIR. Over the course of 2007 through 2019. So this kind of summarizes the credits that have been used for compliance purposes, payments into the fund, and the total compliance owed over the course of those years. A little bit about the usage of credits. There is a maximum in terms of the amount of the true-up obligation that can be covered through the use of credits. So that's 60% of the tons owed can be met through the use of emissions offsets or emissions performance credits. 40% of the tons owed may be met using pre-2017 vintage. So if you want to make up the extra 20%, it has to be in newer credits, between the difference between the 40 and the 60. 2014 and older credits expire after the 2020 compliance year. And there aren't a large quantity of those remaining. So we fully expect that those will get soaked up with the 2020 compliance reporting period. So we don't expect any significant stranding of credits through expiry over the next few years anyway. Some things that we've observed that can be improved in terms of compliance reporting related to credits. So the credits need to be held by the person responsible in order to use them for compliance purposes, which means that they need to be transferred to that company on the registry. I guess further, when you're using emissions performance credits, those credits need to be held by the facility that's going to be using them on the registry. So the registry accounts basically allow a corporate account plus the creation of facilities under that company. Also would highlight that there are separate tabs in the compliance reporting books for the use of emission offsets and emissions performance credits, and to make sure that those credit types are put in the correct tab. And also, when you're supplying the serial ranges that you're using in the compliance book, that the serial ranges are correct, and that the serial ranges add up to the amount of tons that are being used for compliance. We'll talk a little bit more about verification, but a few things that we've observed potential improvements for verification, and that has to do with the review of production quantities. So because TIER is fundamentally an output-based compliance system, the review of production amounts are of very similar importance to the review of emissions estimates. So that's an important part that the verifiers need to pay attention to. And then also the consistency with the quantification requirements. So we've ported over and published the AQM that we had been using under the CCIR program has been updated and has been published under TIER. So verifiers need to make sure that those quantification requirements are being followed for sources that they apply to. And also verifiers need to make sure that facilities are using the benchmarks that have been assigned to them in filing their compliance, so that the allocation rates are correct. Okay. I think as has been mentioned before, and as we'll go into some description of, deviation requests are available for cases where the quantification methodologies are unable to be followed. And so when you submit a request for a deviation, it's on the basis of being unable to follow the prescription rather than some other method being a preferred method. When the quantification methodology isn't followed and there's no deviation request approved, that should result in a verification finding by the verifier. Again, approval for a deviation is a time-limited item, and so we're looking as part of that request for the pathway for the aggregate to be able to adopt the quantification methodology requirement. And overall, I would say this is a very useful piece of feedback for the department in terms of receiving and looking at the deviation request, because it gives us a good sense of where there's a gap between what we have in the quantification requirements and what's possible for individual facilities under the regulation. A point on confidentiality. So there is an ability to request confidentiality as part of the compliance filing. So when you indicate that you're requesting confidentiality, you need to also send along a letter which outlines the basis on which the data that you're requesting to be held confidential meets the criteria under the regulation for confidential information. And again, the department will reject the unjustified requests or requests that don't meet the criteria laid out in the regulation. So please do have a look at our review letter when we issue it to you. This next section is on obtaining verification, and I'll let Maggie Scott, I guess, run us through this section of the deck.
Okay, thanks, John. So next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to run through some of the verification requirements under tier. So all facilities, including opted-in, large emitters, and aggregate facilities that are regulated under tier, must retain a third-party assurance provider or a verifier to verify their compliance report before it's submitted. The purpose of the verification is to provide assurance to the department that there are no material errors in the facility's compliance report. So the compliance submission for the 2020 reporting period is due on June 30th, 2021, and the facility is required to submit a verification report along with their compliance submission. And the verification report is prepared by the verifier, which also includes some signed forms prepared by the verifier. And this includes the statement of verification, statement of qualification, and a conflict of interest checklist. For 2020, we are expecting about 460 facilities that will submit compliance reports and thus require verifications, which is more than double from 2019. So we do anticipate that verification will be very busy this year. And if folks are finding difficult to complete the verification or find a verifier, please do contact the department, and we can provide some guidance on that. Verifications do typically take up to 6 or more weeks, depending on the complexity of the facility. So we do recommend that facilities start to look for a verifier if you haven't yet, and get started on the verification process. So the standard for validation, verification, and audit outlines the requirements for the verification process. And in particular, Section 8 outlines the verification requirements and guidance that is specifically for aggregate facilities. Some of the main highlights of a verification process includes the following here. So the first step typically requires a conflict of interest assessment that's conducted by the verifier. And this is to determine whether there is any conflict for the verifier to conduct the verification and ensuring that they are truly independent from the facility. So for instance, if a consultant is doing the reporting on behalf of a facility, then that would exclude them from being able to conduct a third-party verification for the same report. So once it has been determined that there are no conflicts, a contract can be executed between the facility and the verifier. And just keep in mind that these contracts are between the facility and the verifier, and we are not involved in the contracting process. So it is critically important for the facility to ensure that there is some requirement for the verifier to meet the regulatory requirements that are under tier and also in the standard. So as part of the verification process, the verifier will typically review all sorts of documentation, such as the compliance report itself, supporting evidence that is used as part of the compliance submission, calculation workbooks, data sets, etc. And this is typically included in the verification plan that they're designing. And so the verification plan itself will provide the verification procedures that the verifier will be conducting, which is based on a risk assessment, and then of course developing a sampling plan that mitigates the risks that are identified by the verifier during the verification process. So again, the verifier will request data and information from the facility for review during the verification process. As part of the verification process, a site visit is also required, and we'll dive into that a little bit more in the next slide. Once the verifier has collected all of the data information, they will conduct a review and analysis and assess whether there are any issues or verification findings. And this is the point where the verifier will communicate any issues back with the facility. If there are material issues identified, the expectation is that the facility would resolve those material issues before a compliance report submission, and of course before a verification can be completed with a positive opinion. So all of these issues and findings that are identified in the verification process would then be provided in the verification report. And we do have a verification report template that is available for verifiers to use, and it is on our tier website. So going back to the site visit requirement, so per the standard, a site visit is required unless it's otherwise approved by the director. Specifically for aggregates, verifiers may use a risk-based approach to determine what sites that they're going to conduct as part of the site visit, with recognition that aggregate facilities is a combination of many sites and not just one facility. So we do rely on the verifier to determine which sites would be appropriate for the site visit. We do encourage verifiers to select different types of conventional oil and gas facilities. And again, this would be dependent on the verifier's risk assessment and what would be appropriate for the verification process. The verifier is required to conduct a site visit at the location where the data is managed for the aggregate facility. So this could be, say, a head office, or somewhere specific where that data is maintained for the aggregate facility. Next slide, please. So because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the director has granted authorization to verifiers to conduct what we call a virtual or remote site visits up to September 1st, 2021. So this includes verifications of 2020 compliance reports, benchmark applications, and emission offset project reports that are submitted by September 1st, 2021. So verifiers that have previously conducted verifications in Alberta would have received a letter giving that authorization already. If you do have a verifier that's conducting a verification in your facility but had not received this authorization, please do contact us, and we can provide a letter giving that authorization for the verifier to conduct a virtual site visit. The requirements of a virtual site visit are provided in the verification standards. So please do take a look at some of those requirements and some guidance on how a virtual site visit is conducted. So as Peter mentioned earlier, part one of the standard does outline the mandatory requirements for third-party assurance providers and auditors. Some of the key points here is that facilities do need to ensure that the verifier that's selected to conduct the verification for them does meet these regulatory requirements that are specified not only in the regulation, but in part one of the standard. So in addition to these specific requirements in the standard and the regulation, we have also required that verifiers complete verification training in order to conduct verifications of the 2020 compliance reports that are submitted in June. So earlier this year in January and February, we held some live sessions for verifiers to attend on the verification training. If you are a verifier and haven't completed the verification training, we do have it available on the TIER website now, the recorded session, and as well an online quiz that you can complete and submit to us. We will be providing confirmation emails to those who have attended the training. So you should be receiving a note from us if you did attend and complete that training online, or if you completed the quiz that is available on the website. Again, just a quick note, if you're a facility and you are having some issues finding a verifier, again, please reach out to us at aap.gc@gov.ab.ca, and maybe we can provide some guidance on that and some direction on that. So we do want to point out that there are some contraventions in the regulation that are considered to be offenses, and specifically, there is a requirement that third-party assurance providers must follow the standard for validation, verification, and audit when conducting verifications. And as well, just to reiterate the point above, both the facility and the verifier is responsible for ensuring that the verifier meets the qualifications and experience requirements that are outlined in the regulation and in the standard. Next slide, thank you. So here's just some general requirements for verifiers and verifications. So there is a requirement that verifiers can only conduct verifications for a regulated facility for up to 5 consecutive years. At which point a 2-year break is required in order for the same verifier to conduct a verification for that particular facility. So for aggregate facilities, these are all obviously new, and 2020 is the first year of compliance reports. So 5 years down the road, if you are using the same verifier consecutively over the next 5 years, then the verifier would need to take a break for 2 years before they can perform another verification for your facility. The regulation does require a positive opinion in the statement of verification. Again, as I mentioned before, the expectation is that if there are any material issues that are identified during the verification process, that the facility would resolve these before the compliance report is submitted in June. On occasion, we do get qualified opinions, and qualified opinions are situations where the verifier would like to point out something specific in the verification process that either they could not resolve, or something that is significant that they wanted to highlight. And so for these types of situations, we do evaluate on a case-by-case basis. And of course, if there are any questions on qualifications, please do contact us at the department. And just as a repeat, the verification report does need to be submitted using the verification report template, which is available on our tier website. Next slide, please. So now I'm just going to go over some of the specific verification requirements for verifiers as it relates to aggregate facilities. So again, section 8.1 of the verification standard specifically highlights some requirements for verification of aggregate facilities. Aggregate facilities are composed of many sites of different types, and so the expectation is that it is treated as one facility with one verification plan, one verification report, and one set of signed forms. We wouldn't expect multiple forms for each of the facilities that are within the aggregates. The verifier should confirm that the sites within the aggregate meets the definition of a COG under the regulation. A verifier should assess whether the facility's method to compile the XY coordinates are reasonable. They're expected to conduct a review of the boundary files for sites that have greater than 10,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Verifiers are required to assess that the data for all COGs have been included in the assertion, and assess whether the quantification methodologies that are applicable for the aggregate facility has been followed, and these are specifically outlined in Chapter 15. And then lastly, review the source data that is used for the assertion. So this includes Petronex data, third-party invoices, or potentially meter data that is used for calculations. Okay, lastly, we just want to talk a little bit about the government re-verifications that we perform by the department. So we do conduct re-verifications on a portion of submissions of compliance reports and emission offset reports that are provided to the department. The department has established master agreements with verifiers that we would retain for different re-verification projects, and we would issue what is called statements of work to pre-qualified vendors to conduct these annual re-verifications. The compliance reports or the facilities and projects that are selected on an annual basis is based on a risk-based approach and a random selection process. And we would typically notify the facilities if they have been selected for a re-verification. And generally, the process is very similar to what is outlined in the verification standard, with some focus on individual facilities and projects, or things that we might want to take a look at more closely for certain facilities and projects. And I think that concludes the section on verification requirements, and I'm going to pass it back to John for the AQM.
Thank you, Maggie. So we're going to step through a little bit about Chapter 15 and the quantification methodology. So again, the idea behind the quantification methodology is to provide a consistent, standardized, I guess, transparent approach to quantifying the emissions production or other parameters. So that creates a level playing field for facilities within the same sector and across sectors. It also helps in terms of standardizing benchmarking for regulated facilities to have that consistency. And it also helps in terms of aligning the greenhouse gas reporting in Alberta with what's required for greenhouse gas reporting in other jurisdictions across Canada, and also to the federal government under the greenhouse gas reporting program. So we're going to concentrate on Chapter 15, which deals with the topics that are relevant to aggregate facilities. And again, aggregate facility have a narrower emission scope than other kinds of facilities under the tier regulation. So really the focus there is on the stationary fuel combustion as well as on production. So again, in terms of definition, aggregate facility contains 2 or more conventional oil and gas facilities, and we call those conventional oil and gas facilities. So those COGs, or conventional oil and gas facilities, may contain several sites that are integrated in operation. And for example, a single a COG under tier may be comprised of a number of, I guess, Petronex facility IDs. So aggregate facilities are, again, regulated for stationary fuel combustion emissions only. So it's a narrower emission scope. And we've set up the quantification methodologies to rely heavily on Petronex reported data, both for the emissions calculation as well as for the production metric under tier. So the methods generally in the quantification methodologies document are separated out by levels. So where generally higher level numbers are more accurate methods, and often may require additional data or more data than the lower level methods. So for Chapter 15 for emissions, we've got a couple of levels for fuel consumption, a couple of levels for carbon dioxide. So on the fuel consumption side, there's a single gas stream approach. So that's really looking at all the fuels that are reported in Petronex for a conventional oil and gas facility, and treating them together as one bulk source with default emissions factors. And then the level 1 method really gets into looking to separate out those fuel streams into kind of characteristic streams at a conventional oil and gas facility, and basically characterizing those fuel streams separately. And then the third method there in terms of fuel consumption is looking at third-party supplied fuels. And so these are often fuels not reported in Petronex, for example, such as gasoline, diesel, propane purchases, things of that nature. And then on the emissions side, we get into the use of a single default emissions factor on the level 0. And then into level 1, we're looking at the gas characterization, fuel gas characterization for looking at multiple gas streams. So that's either through higher heating value or gas composition. And then there's also the application of default emissions factors for what we call non-variable fuels. And so again, those non-variable fuels are typically propane, gasoline, diesel. So we also have levels. Well, we kind of don't have levels, I guess, on the methane and nitrous oxide side of things. So the options that we've got available there, which are kind of acceptable at either level 0 or level 1, are default emissions factors for non-variable fuels. So that's basically, again, non-variable fuels, gasoline, diesel, propane. Sector-based factors for variable fuels, or technology specific factors for variable fuels. On the production side, really we're looking at some combination of Petronex production volumes generally on the production side of things. So again, with the single fuel gas stream approach, method 1, we're assuming really there's one fuel type consumed at the COG for fuel gas, and that the facility may then sum up the fuel consumed across the COG as reported through Petronex into one overall sum of fuel. The method 2 really looks at having splitting up and having multiple fuel gas streams. So the advantage of this is that you can then get into a characterization of those fuel gas streams, either with the gas composition or the higher heating values. And so you can more accurately then characterize the CO2 emissions from the site. So in terms of adopting the multiple fuel gas stream approach, one of our requirements there is that you're applying or you're measuring either the composition of the gas or the higher heating value of the gas on a quarterly basis. So fuel consumption, in the case where you're looking at multiple gas streams, would then be internal to the facility. So where you're splitting consumption into multiple streams, you're looking at using internal metering to basically separate out those streams from the totals that are reported in Petronex. So the other methods that we have for quantifying fuels would be third-party invoices or third-party metering. So that would be applicable in the case where you're talking about purchasing propane, gasoline, diesel, things of that nature. Okay. So for the CO2 emissions, if you're using a single gas stream approach, then you'd be looking to apply the default emissions factor for that single gas stream. And so we've provided the emissions factor for that stream based on a default rich gas composition in the standard. And then your CO2 is really then calculated as your fuel consumption volume times the emissions factor in that case. I should maybe emphasize again, we have provided choice or flexibility at the conventional oil and gas facility level for the methods that are chosen. But again, we're looking for consistency where people are setting a 2019 benchmark. We are looking for consistency in method between the benchmark setting and the compliance reporting. Okay, so again, a little bit on the use of default gas emissions factors. Just as I was saying, we're looking again for that consistency between benchmark and compliance reporting generally. But we have recognized that there's some situations where we may have a gap in available data. So again, we've given some options for filling that gap. So for example, if people would like to use a fuel stream approach or a multiple fuel stream approach in their compliance reporting, but do not have the data to do that historically for setting a 2019 benchmark, we have made available sales gas composition, which can be used for benchmarking in that case. So that's a default emissions factor that's also made available in the AQM. Okay. The other treatment, again, for the non-variable fuels goes back to a default emissions factor. So composition of propane, diesel, gasoline is, I guess, what we consider non-variable. So it's sufficiently consistent that emissions factors can be used against the quantities of propane, diesel, or gasoline to calculate the CO2 produced by consuming those. Again, those volumes are going to trace back to either third-party metering invoices, or in some cases internal metering, where you have a multiple COGs who might be working off of the same invoiced quantities. So CO2 emissions based on fuel gas correlation are an available option for folks that are using the multiple fuel stream approach. So this method is consistent with the federal greenhouse gas reporting requirement, and it's a correlation that's used in that system. So it basically correlates the higher heating value of the gas stream to the CO2 emissions factor. So the method does require, again, the measurement of the higher heating value. And then again, the volumes are going to be characteristic of that stream. So you have to identify the nature of the fuel streams on site. And so for those streams that are sufficiently different than each other, they need to be separated out, and the heating value characterized separately. Where the streams are blended or commingled, or there's a single source of fuel, then basically you're using that single volume against the higher heating value. So again, those volumes are directly metered or through third-party metering or invoices. So the same or similar kind of approach can be taken where instead of using the higher heating value, you use the actual carbon content of the fuel gas. So the gas sample can be characterized for the carbon content, and that carbon content can be applied in order to come up with the CO2 produced by burning the fuel. So the same thing could be done for a liquid fuel based on carbon content. Probably most of the liquid fuel consumed in many of the sites fall under our category of non-variable fuels, but where they did not, you could also use the carbon content for liquid fuel purposes. So moving from CO2 emissions to methane and nitrous oxide emissions, again, when we're looking at the non-variable fuels, we're looking at a default emissions factor for methane and nitrous oxide. The other options for, I guess, variable fuels are to look at either sector-based emissions factors or default equipment-based emissions factors. And so the main advantage probably of going to a equipment-based emissions factor approach is to be able to recognize over time improvement in equipment or in equipment controls that have an impact on your methane or nitrous oxide emissions for those pieces of equipment. So in any of these cases, really the calculation is structured as a fuel quantity times an emissions factor on a volume basis, or potentially a fuel quantity times a higher heating value times an emissions factor on an energy basis. So that's the method of applying those emissions factors that we've supplied in the AQM. So again, what we're kind of looking at is consistency within a COG. So we are looking for folks not to be mixing methods, I guess, within the same single conventional oil and gas facility. We'd again like consistency between the benchmarking time period and the compliance period, and so that's, for a lot of folks, that's going to happen automatically in 2020, where you're using a 2020 benchmark year. But that's maybe a more important consideration for people that are submitting a 2019 benchmark application. And again, consistent with the intent of the equipment-based emissions factor, the idea is that if you're using equipment-based emissions factors, that technology that's in place can evolve over time and be reflected in which particular equipment-based emissions factor you're using as your equipment changes or additional controls are put in place there. Switching gears a little bit, the AQM also speaks to the selection of benchmark units and the options for benchmark units. So we did provide some flexibility here as we moved into tier, understanding that there's a lot of variability in the nature of the operations of the conventional oil and gas facilities. And so we've kind of put together two broad options. So option one is to use predefined units here. So we have a selection of production as reported through Petronex, dispositions as reported through Petronex, or receipts. And in those cases, those are all in meters cubed oil equivalent. So those are our three defaults, which by the look of things seem like they're going to work in the broad swath of cases, probably kind of a 90-10 rule kind of situation. And then we also have put forward option two, which has a little bit more flexibility. So that basically allows you to combine, potentially multiple production accounting metrics from Petronex in order to produce something that correlates better with the facility's emissions. So that's primarily for use where the option one fails to create a reasonable correlation against emissions. That's really the case where we'd start to explore option two to see if there's another combination of production metrics from Petronex that's going to work better. So when we're looking at how to assign the benchmark units, and many folks have submitted benchmark unit applications, so this is probably familiar to folks. Part of what we're looking for is, is there a strong month-to-month correlation between the unit and the emissions? And we're taking that month-to-month correlation as kind of a proxy for what may be the year-over-year variation that we might see, which could result in a lot of oscillation in the compliance outcomes in the tons owed. We're also looking for kind of whether it creates consistency in the emissions intensities, so that those things are related, and also whether it reasonably represents the composition of the aggregate facility. So again, the benchmark unit, there's a couple of ways that gets arrived on. So it can be requested by the person responsible for an aggregate facility through an application, either an application for a benchmark unit, or if you're applying for a 2019 benchmark, there's also implicitly an application for a benchmark unit in there, really. So again, if you've applied for it, we're in the process of reviewing those, and we're aiming to get our letters out to folks in April. And again, if you haven't applied for those, we're also going through the process of working with the Petronex data to come up with the best available benchmark unit for communication also in the April timeframe. So I'll stop there. It looks like we've got a number of questions, so maybe this is a good a timely break for that. Okay. So maybe I'll read these out. Peter and Maggie, you can jump in if you want to grab any of them. So in oil and gas, we will have acquisitions and divestitures within aggregates through the year. At what point does another benchmark application need to be redone for the aggregate? So I think we are looking to set some thresholds where, you know, there's a sufficient amount of change to benchmark that we need to revisit the aggregate. So we are looking at some of the criteria for that, and I think it's helpful for us that we're getting some of the benchmark application data or the benchmark unit application data at the facility level. So that'll make it a little bit easier for us to make adjustments to benchmarks where they do have to be changed. Again, we're looking at a 10% reduction target in the aggregate space. So probably something that triggers a change in the benchmark of 2 or 3% becomes significant with regard to the target, but we haven't set any of those thresholds in stone yet. Question here: what is the data flow map of Petronex to AER to Department of Energy? I don't. Maybe we'll skip that question because I don't think we can speak for the Department of Energy on their behalf. So maybe we'll set that one aside. Is self-produced and used natural gas subject to Petronex reporting? Also, would there have been a federal carbon tax for it prior to applying to tier? So self-produced natural gas, I do believe, is subject to fuel reporting under Petronex. The province previously had a provincial levy, and part of that provincial levy was, I guess, an exemption for the upstream oil and gas sector till 2023. I guess that regulation was repealed, and the federal fuel charge came into effect at the start of 2020. So it would have been at the start of 2020 that self-use natural gas would have been subject to a federal fuel charge. And then I think, hopefully as people know, being regulated under tier allows folks to have an exemption certificate from that federal fuel charge. Okay, what is the process when quantification methodologies are updated after submission of benchmark or compliance, such as having a flaring quantification submitted for benchmark, but there being a new methodology released afterwards? So that's a good question. So we do from time to time update our quantification methodologies, and when we do that, I think we have a bit of an eye to whether those changes are going to create a significant difference from the methods that were used for benchmarking. If there are some circumstances where the answer is, yes, that's going to create a significant difference, we may have to work with facilities to update or adjust their benchmarks in that case. We've got a question here. Is the reporter a person or a facility? So when we talk about the role of the reporter, that's an individual who submits the compliance report for the facility, and in many cases prepares the compliance report. Does TIER use the same fuel gas definitions as AER in Directive 60? So I think in general, what we've laid out is that we are aligned in terms of using the Petronex fuel volumes for the purposes of TIER. So we understand that there have been some changes kind of transitioning into 2020 in terms of better separating out vented or flared fuels. So I think we are expecting that we're, I guess, better aligned in terms of stationary fuel combustion with the Petronex reporting for 2020 onwards. Okay. Would it be considered method 2 for fuel consumption if the gas composition or higher heating value and meter flow is from a third-party provider? I'd have to map that to the method numbers, but I don't think it's a problem for the higher heating value or the meter volume to be from a third-party provider. I think that's consistent with the methodologies that we've laid out here. Any comment on that one, Maggie?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think the expectation is that there's reliance on either the supplier data to be used in the emissions quantification or metering that's done by the facility. So I think that's consistent with what we have.
Okay. So next question is an interesting question. During the verification, if the verification body finds the fuel volumes reported to Petronex for an individual facility within the COG did not correct their fuel volume to 15 degrees Celsius in 1 atmosphere, does the facility need to correct the fuel volume to STP before using them in the emissions calculations, or should the facility still use incorrect Petronex volumes for the emissions calculations? So this is an area I'm not super expert in. I guess what I would imagine would be the preferred approach would be to create a correction, I guess, to the reported Petronex value so that it reflects the correct STP conditions, and then that would restore, I guess, alignment with the AQM intention to use the Petronex values. I guess that would be my best advice. If you do need to make a correction and you can't make that back to Petronex, we're certainly able to support a deviation for this kind of correction if that's needed. Based on the answer to one of the questions, for aggregates, Petronex data is acceptable and is not necessary to trace data back to meter data. Do verifiers are required to check Petronex meter calibrations for aggregate facilities? So I think the short answer to that is, I mean, we have set out the AQM to base off of the Petronex data. So I don't think in these cases we would need a trace back to meter calibrations for aggregate facilities. I think we are as a group with an AEP, I think we are intending to work a little bit more with AER to kind of understand the existing quality assurance systems that are in place for the Petronex reported data, just to see where there's opportunities to add to the systems that they already have for assurance. But I think the short answer is that we've in our AQM identified Petronex data as I guess reliable source for these calculations. There is a discrepancy in the definition of on-site transportation between ECC and AEP. One is used for transfer products or products-related materials. One is all mobile within boundary. Which one is applied here? So again, for aggregates, on-site transportation is not in scope for the aggregate treatment. If we're talking about opt-in or large final emitter facilities, then I would refer you back, I guess, to the definition of direct emissions, which is comprehensive, but does also exclude emissions from fuels where the federal fuel charge was paid during a time when you had an exemption certificate in place. Please provide the motivation for quarterly fuel gas sampling. Comply with this frequency to avoid default CO2 emission factors without significant sampling costs. Will this be considered an annual? Will this be reconsidered to annual sampling, since fuel gas streams typically don't change significantly in composition? So I guess we have provided the options to use default factors or to go the gas composition route. The quarterly sampling is, I guess, significantly less frequent than what's required for large emitters and opt-in facilities. And I guess I would also say that we are under a fairly sensitive system in terms of a 10% reduction target in terms of what we would consider to be significant or non-significant changes in composition. So I think the quarterly sampling is what we put forward as minimum reasonable accuracy for purpose. Is quarterly sampling required for HHV content and carbon content methodologies, even if a single fuel gas approach is used? So quarterly sampling is not required if you wish to use a single fuel gas approach with the default factors that are provided. Is method 15.4 default the fuel gas composition factor for CO2 consistent with the GHGRP? And so in our discussions with Environment Climate Change Canada, the answer was yes, that is consistent. Peter, maybe let me know how we're doing for time, if you think we can take a few more of these, or what your view is. So does the verifier need to assess the R value as being acceptable or not? I take this as for not for being for compliance reporting, but for benchmark 2019 benchmark application. And I think the verifier should confirm that the R value is, I guess, correctly calculated. I don't think they have to make a determination whether or not it's acceptable. We'll do that as part of our consideration in the benchmark application. Okay, in instances where a compressor station is part of operator A's aggregate, however, the fuel used by the compressor station is reported to Petronex under a gathering system in operator B's aggregate, with the final end use by operator A's compressor station noted from to facility ID or node ID field in Petronex. Which operator is required to report the emissions associated with the fuel used by the compressors? Operator A, the operator of the compressor station, or operator B, the Petronex reporter of the facility? So this is a good question. I think maybe we need to take this one offline. I'd understood that in most cases we're pretty well aligned between the fuel reporting and the Petronex facility doing the operation. So maybe we can take this one offline and circle back to understand the situation better.
Sorry, just to jump in for a second there, John. I'm going to propose we keep moving through the rest of the deck. We will have an extended question and answer period at the end of the presentation. And of course, if there are any questions that we don't necessarily get to today, please do email them to us at the aap.ghg email address, and we'll get to those as quickly as we can. But I'll propose let's keep moving.
Okay, sounds good, Peter. And you're taking this next set of slides, is that correct?
Yeah, you bet.
Okay.
Okay, so the next section we'll go over some of the methods of compliance, a general overview of how the true-up obligation is determined, and some of the details about how to remit compliance payments or satisfy true-up obligations. Next slide, please. So this infographic provides a general overview of the compliance obligation credit systems under tier. Each regulated facility, and in this example, we have facility A and facility B, will have an assigned benchmark. Facilities like facility A, who emit more than their benchmark, owe a true-up obligation. That obligation can be met using emissions performance credits or Alberta-based emissions offsets purchased on Alberta's carbon market or banked by an organization, or by paying the carbon price for the compliance year for 2020, that'd be $30 a ton, into the tier compliance fund per ton of emissions owed. Emissions performance credits may be produced by facilities like Facility B here that beat their emissions benchmark, and those credits can be used for compliance for other facilities in an organization's fleet, or they can be sold on the carbon market to other facilities that might be interested in using them to satisfy their obligation. Alberta-based emissions offsets can also be traded on the market. They may be produced by non-regulated activities that reduce emissions. In this example, we've got some wind power production producing offsets. And we are going to jump into a little more details about the offset system, and I'm going to turn it over for a second to Jason. Jason's one of our emissions offset policy advisors in the Climate Implementation and Compliance branch.
Thanks, Peter. John, I think we'll just need to click a few times on the slide. Okay, so yeah, just wanted to provide some context to all of you about the Alberta emission offset system, and also to identify that there might still be opportunities for some of your facilities to participate in the program as well. So the offset system in general, as the slide says, its purpose is to provide another compliance option for facilities, which include, of course, aggregate facilities. The offset system differs in that it covers some voluntary activities as well. There's a list here of some of the specific additional aspects of the system, but I'm happy to answer more questions about those specifically. Can we go to the next slide, please, John? So offset activities that are eligible to generate offsets have to have a protocol, an approved protocol, and this is just a list of the currently approved protocols. So you can see that they cover many sectors of Alberta's economy. Of particular note to, I think the COGS will be just the bottom right section here. We have 3 protocols: greenhouse gas emission reductions from pneumatic devices, solution gas conservation, which is currently under revision, and the engine fuel management and gas capture protocol. So the bottom 2 are also flagged because other issues have been identified with them, or like with the solution gas one, we are revising at the moment. So we can speak to those in if there are specific questions, but the system has also had previous protocols. Like in this morning's session, someone asked about acid gas injection offset projects. And I just want to flag, I guess, that some previous protocols have been either withdrawn, like the acid gas one, or they've been merged together into the list that is here. So their protocols are withdrawn when activities are essentially no longer practiced or are no longer eligible for some reason, or there are problems with the protocol that can't be resolved. So next slide, please, John. So yeah, just wanted to give everyone a sense of the activity that's been part of the offset system. So this is just a figure of all of the offsets that have been generated by protocol type and by the status of the offset at the moment. So like in the orange color, those are offsets that have already been used for compliance by facility. In the dark brown or burgundy color is the types of offsets that are still available. So you can see from wind and from the carbon capture, CO2 capture and permanent storage in deep saline aquifers. Those are some of the largest constituents of our offsets that are still active at the moment. So in total, there are just over 13 megatons available at the moment. as well. And 30 or 52 megatons have been used to date for compliance. So next slide, please. This is just a quick overview of how offsets have been used for compliance over time. And I wanted to just highlight that this is a system that has been growing and its usage has been significant. Next slide, please. Just then finally wanted to overview that in addition to the solution gas protocol that I mentioned, we have 3 other protocols that are currently under development or revision. And these are the ones listed here. So like I said, the system is growing and we continually welcome proponents who have ideas for offset projects or project types to come to us and we can discuss developing them. If you're interested in that, I can also describe that process in more detail through the Q&A. Actually, one last thing I wanted to cover, and I think we need to go back to that slide to slide 55, John. Right before the fund part. So someone asked this earlier in the Q&A already, but I just wanted to highlight again that the carbon market in the circle here, how you might be able to access that, you know, in through your computer is just that it exists on a website called, well, it's hosted by the Canadian Standards Association. So they are our third-party vendor that regulates that site, but all of the offsets and EPCs are listed on there, but transactions between owners and facilities happens off of that market, happens between those companies directly, but they're listed there. So I think I'll hand it back to you, Peter.
Thanks, Jason. I'm going to move through these next few slides here fairly quickly, and I know there's a lot of terms there that are defined. I'm not going to run through and define every single term, but just to note that each one of these definitions and equations are listed in either the regulation itself or the standards under the regulation. So if you are interested in reviewing the terms in a bit more detail, you can find them there for reference, and we'll also be posting the slide deck online for review. But I'll just give a kind of a quick general overview. In terms of some of the key terms and equations relevant to determining regulated emissions and true-up obligations for regulated facilities under the regulation, firstly, total regulated emissions for aggregate facilities are determined using the equation you see here. Total regulated emissions are the sum of stationary fuel combustion emissions and stationary fuel combustion emissions resulting from production of useful heat or energy that's exported. It's required for the stationary fuel combustion emissions from exports to be broken out like this for broader tier accounting purposes. Next slide, please. So this equation defines the facility-specific benchmark for each facility. In short term, the FSB is the average emissions intensity of the benchmark unit over the benchmark period or the baseline period for an aggregate, less the 10% reduction target. Next slide, please. Net emissions are the total regulated emissions for the facility minus emissions offsets, emissions performance credits, and credits for fund payments submitted for compliance for the compliance year. Allowable emissions are defined here. In short, the allowable emissions are the reported emissions that are allocated freely, derived from the facility-specific benchmark and the production of the benchmark product for an aggregate facility for the year. And finally, drilling down, the true-up obligation is determined by subtracting the allowable emissions from the net emissions for a facility for a compliance year. And just a few reminders about the required contents of compliance submission package. So there's the completed aggregate compliance form itself, which we'll be providing a bit of a video overview of shortly here. A signed statement of certification, a third-party verification report, including a signed statement of verification, a signed statement of qualifications, and a signed conflict of interest checklist, and a confidentiality request for specified parts of the submission. This is optional, and persons responsible can elect to do this if they'd like to request that confidentiality. Each one of the kind of the last three bullets here, the statement of certification, the verification report, and the confidentiality request, more details and information about those are included in the standards if you're interested in reviewing. And I'll turn over to John to give a bit of an overview of the process for making compliance true-up payments and submissions, as well as specified gas reporting regulation requirements for aggregate facilities.
Okay, thank you, Peter. So again, when you have your package verified and all the materials together, you can send that via email to our AEP GHG box. If you're needing to make a payment, that could be made by check to Government of Alberta at the address below, and this address is also in the compliance form, or it can be made through electronic transfer, and the details are given here. Our finance group will issue you a receipt for your payment, and they'll also send that receipt onto us for our records of having purchased that quantity of fund credits. As far as using credits for compliance, so again, credits can be used for up to 60% of your true-up obligation. So in order to use credits, those credits, whether they're emissions performance credits or emissions offsets, must be placed in a pending retired state on the registry prior to submitting your compliance report. It's advised to allow 10 business days in terms of getting your instructions to the registry before they're able to necessarily transact on your instruction. It will be a busy period for the registry around the compliance due date, so do give them some time to act on your instructions. For EPCs, those must be retired to the facility that is using them for true-up purposes. And so if you're new to TIER, which many folks for sure will be, and you wanted to use EPCs for compliance purposes, I guess our advice would be to create an account for your company and also create a facility on the registry. And so that facility is to represent your aggregate, and that facility would be needed also in the case where you're going to request emissions performance credits in order for those emissions performance credits to be issued to you. I'll say a couple things, a couple quick slides here on the specified gas reporting regulation. So the specified gas reporting regulation has been around for quite a while. It kind of grew out of voluntary reporting efforts started in the 90s by facilities in Alberta. So it's a required item for those sites that emit more than 10,000 tons in a year. So for those conventional oil and gas facilities that are over that threshold, the specified gas reporting regulation, as well as the federal greenhouse gas reporting regulation, would apply. The provincial data and the federal data are submitted, I guess, jointly through the single window SWIM system with the federal government. So we're continuing with the one window reporting program with the federal government in order to I guess, reduce the number of instances of reporting that are required there. Again, this emissions data is used to help inform policy development, and it also supports the federal government's preparation of their national inventory report numbers for international reporting. The annual reporting deadline is June 1st. There's going to be some updates to the to the standard this year, so look for that, mainly to again align with the recently published AQM. For facilities regulated under tier, we're looking for those folks to use the published Alberta greenhouse gas quantification methodology, so that you can report the same figures through the tier program as you can through the GHGRP and the specified gas reporting program. For folks not regulated in tier, they can use either the recently published AQM or the methodology that was current from last year, which was the quantification methodologies for carbon competitiveness incentive regulation and the specified gas reporting regulation. So that gives the flexibility for folks that aren't regulated under tier to go ahead and report in the same manner as they did last year. Tier 1 methodologies in those documents are the minimum requirements. So I guess in this case, level, the minimum level requirements will satisfy the GHGRP program. And one thing I'll maybe draw attention to, the SWIM system will have a drop down asking you to identify the Alberta methodologies that you're using. And so the folks in charge of the SGRR will publish a bit of a mapping to make it clear for everybody what you can choose in that SWIM interface when you're asked for the methodology numbers and you're using the AQM approach. So that'll be forthcoming shortly. And also, I guess a note, production reporting requirements were dropped for products that compete with products in tier. So some of the production reporting requirements under SGRR have been relaxed there too. Okay. So now we're going to do a bit of a walkthrough of the reporting form for the aggregate facilities for 2020.
Hello, I'll provide an overview of the Technology, Innovation, and Emissions Reduction Compliance Reporting Form for aggregate facilities using 2020 as a benchmark year. The compliance report form is an Excel book with multiple tabs. Its purpose is to collect information demonstrating that the aggregate facility is in compliance with the regulation. We will take the next few minutes to do a brief walkthrough of each of the tabs from left to right. If your workbook opens in protected mode, please go to the File, Info menu to turn off protected mode. Please also enable macros for this workbook. We will start at the Instructions tab. Here we provide a brief summary of the purpose of the book and how to configure and complete it. On the Submissions tab, you may enter the compliance year being reported on. If you believe the information you are supplying on the compliance form meets the threshold to be considered confidential under Section 28 of the regulation, please indicate yes under the drop-down for the drop-down menu and supply a letter with your submission detailing which information meets that threshold and how it qualifies. Information is also supplied on this tab about documents which should accompany your form, as well as record retention requirements. Please note our preference is that the Statement of Certification tab be signed electronically and submitted as part of the compliance workbook. The next tab is called Section A. Generally, Section A tabs collect administrative information. The Section A tab contains information about the facility, including the facility name and the assigned identifier under tier. Please note that fields with a red notification tag have associated information with them. And if you hover your mouse over the field, you can see the additional instructions that are provided. Information is also collected on the role of reporter, who completes and typically submits the form, the certifying official, who is signing off on the contents of the form, and the public contact for the facility. The next tab, Section A4, is provided for a case where the facility has chosen to have an external consultant complete the compliance form. We now move into the B sections of the form, where emissions and production data are reported. In section B1 and B2, all of the aggregate emissions of CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide are reported, with the exception of CO2 from biomass and emissions from fuel that has had the federal fuel charge paid during a period when the facility had a federal exemption in place. In section B1, please list for each Petronex facility the methods used for measuring fuel consumption, CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. Enter the fuel volume as reported through Petronex, and also the resulting tons of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Also enter the facility, the tier facility name. And the 3-character identifier that was given to the tier facility, as well as the Petronex ID. Please note that the same methodologies must be used within a single conventional oil and gas facility. Also, in the case that you are using a 2019 benchmark year, the same methodology should be used for each, as were used for calculating your benchmark values for each cog. The form will calculate the carbon dioxide equivalents and roll up totals for your aggregate. Moving to section B2, this sheet is for the reporting of emissions from fuel use not reported through Petronex. It includes sections for indicating all the methods applied to fuel gas and non-variable fuels. It also has areas to report the usage of various fuels not reported through Petronex. These fuels can be reported either in volume units or in energy units. There is also a field to report exported CO2 from stationary fuel combustion. Most aggregates will not have any quantity to report here. The bottom part of the sheet shows the calculated total regulated emissions for the aggregate. Section B6 is for the reporting of production. Start by entering the product and associated units which have been assigned to you by the department. If you're using the version of the form that's for people being assigned a 2019 benchmark, you'll need to enter your assigned facility-specific benchmark here also. You may also report electricity exported from conventional oil and gas facilities belonging to the aggregate, if applicable. Then for each Petronex site belonging to the aggregate, report the production as it was reported in Petronex or as calculated from Petronex values. The form will calculate the total production automatically. Moving to section E. This tab calculates the facility-specific benchmark for those using 2020 as a benchmark year based on the reported emissions and production. You'll see this value also appears in section B6 automatically. Moving to section E1, this tab provides an overview of total regulated emissions, allowed emissions, total true-up obligation, as well as credit usage limits. It also indicates if the facility may be eligible to request emissions performance credits. Section 2 shows the number of fund credits the facility has purchased and is using for compliance. It also asks to confirm that the person responsible owns the credits and is using them only once. Fund credits need to be purchased in advance of submitting your compliance report and before June 30th. Section E3 is for reporting the emissions offsets that are being used for compliance. Credits are reported by vintage, either pre-2017 or later, in order to ensure that the corresponding usage limits are met. Please list the serial ranges being retired for compliance in this portion of the form. Check these ranges carefully as they are often a source of error in compliance reporting. Also answer the questions at the bottom of the tab regarding the validity of the offsets being used. Similar to section E3, section E4 is for reporting emissions performance credits used for compliance. Again, these are separated by vintage into pre-2017 and 2017 or later. Section E5 provides an overview of the compliance actions and confirms if sufficient true-up obligation has been provided. This takes into account the limits in use of credits by vintage. Please address any issues flagged in this sheet before you submit your compliance workbook. Moving to section G, this section is to provide details about your third-party assurance provider, including who the signing authority is, contact information for the firm, and how they are qualified under the regulation. Section H should be filled out to give contact information for various roles within the verification team. The next tab is the conflict of interest checklist. This should be filled out by the verifier and confirms if any of the listed questions are true for the engagement. If so, the verifier should contact the department. A signed copy of this sheet should be included as part of the verification report. The statement of qualifications should be filled out by both the designated signing authority and the lead verifier of the third-party assurance provider, where these may be different individuals. It attests to the qualifications of the lead verifier and the third-party assurance provider, and a signed copy should be included in the verification report. The statement of verification is to be completed by the third-party assurance provider and signed by both the lead verifier and designated signing authority, where these are different individuals. The signed copy should be included as part of the third-party verification report. The statement of certification is the last signature sheet in the book, other than the EPC request sheet, and should be signed electronically within Excel by the certifying official. To do this, the certifying official will need to set up a certificate. This can be done at no cost through Windows. Double-click on the X within the signature box. A dialog will appear. You may either sign within the box or select an image of your signature. The bottom part of the signature box will show who has provided the signature. This should match the indicated certifying official in the form. Further edits to the compliance report will clear the signature. Please do not sign the workbook until it is complete and you are ready to submit it. If the facility is requesting emissions performance credits as a result of their annual compliance filing, the emissions performance request sheet needs to be completed and signed. Please outline the activities or changes in practice that have led to intensity improvements at the facility. The fund credit purchase tab should be completed and sent along with your payment or in advance of your payment to our financial services branch. If you wish, you may make one fund payment to cover multiple aggregate facilities. Each facility should be indicated in the table at the bottom of this tab. Again, payment should be completed before submitting your compliance report. You'll be issued a receipt for your payment, which will also be shared with our compliance team. That concludes this overview of the compliance reporting form. As always, if you have questions about the use of this form, you may submit them to aep.ghg@gov.ab.ca. Thank you.
Okay, so that returns us to our slide deck here. I think, Peter, the next slides may be yours, and then we'll move into a final Q&A session, I think.
Sure. Sounds good. So, and I've seen a couple of questions come in about some of the policy updates and ongoing implementation updates for the conventional gas approach come in already. And I think this should answer those. Next slide, please. There are a couple of items specifically that I want to mention that we are continuing to work on within AEP. and look at for potential future implementation for the aggregate approach. The first is the baseline year approach for benchmarking purposes for 2021 and onwards. It is something that we are actively looking at currently within the policy team. Some of the key considerations of the process is ensuring that whatever approach we take is representative over time. We are considering the potential of 2020 to be an anomaly year and maybe not strictly representative over the longer term. And we are also considering that, we've taken a somewhat flexible approach for 2020 compliance, and that we did allow for either the default approach to be used or for a 2019 baseline to be used for aggregate facilities. I think we did see some uptake in that voluntary option, and we do want to be mindful of administrative effort of the outcome of whatever approach we take. So that is something that we are considering as well. Just in terms of timing, as I mentioned, it's something that we're looking at now. We are aiming to have a final decision and communicate that decision out to stakeholders by the end of spring. So stay tuned for that. Our primary means of notification will be through both the TIER conventional and gas website, as well as our stakeholder mailing list. If you haven't already subscribed to that list, you can do so on the TIER conventional gas website. There's a sign up form at the very bottom of the page, and I would encourage you to subscribe if you haven't already. The second item is high performance benchmarks for the sector. So as folks are aware, that's not something that we've implemented for the sector at this time. It is something that we are intending to look at this year. We'll be evaluating the option to implement them in 2021 and onwards. A key part of that analysis is the compliance reporting data that we'll be receiving for the sector in June. So that will be a key input into that consideration. And as I mentioned, the earliest possible implementation for those HPDs for the sector would be making them available for the 2021 compliance year if we were to proceed. And I'll kind of wrap things up here with a review of some key dates and deadlines that are upcoming. And this infographic should look familiar to folks. It's taken directly from our TIER conventional and gas website. So coming up on June 30th, as we've been discussing, that is our compliance reporting deadline for the 2020 compliance year. On September 1st, we've got a deadline coming up for benchmark applications for 2021. So that would be for new aggregate facilities that first entered TIER for the 2021 compliance year. On December 1st, we've got a number of deadlines listed for that date, including adding a facility to an existing aggregate facility for 2021, removing a facility from an existing aggregate for 2022 and onwards. That's the deadline to apply to revoke an aggregate designation entirely for 2022 and onwards. And finally, that's the application deadline for a new aggregate designation for 2022 and onwards. We will be keeping that infographic on the website up to date to reflect upcoming deadlines as they approach. So that should be a resource that folks can jump to if they're looking to review deadlines. And finally, just a reminder that if you did submit a question in the workshop today and we weren't able to get to it or we're not able to get to it by the time we wrap up, of course, feel free to email that to aep.ghg@gov.ab.ca, and we'll endeavor to respond as quickly as we can to that. And with that, we've reached the end of the presentation, and we'll take a few more minutes here to tackle any outstanding questions.
Okay, that sounds good. I think we've got one question here off the hopper that maybe we can answer. So when is natural gas not reported in Petronex? I don't think we're maybe familiar enough with the ins and outs of the Petronex reporting requirement to say what that situation may be. We do have as you saw, a field where if that value is not reported in Petronex, it could be reported here. Maybe that relates to an earlier question we got about the fuel used within a compressor being reported somewhere upstream of the compressor. Okay, we had a couple of questions here that I think maybe I was going to let Maggie speak to a little bit in terms of the applicability of our methodologies to the greenhouse gas reporting program. So maybe Maggie, you could speak to a little bit of the conversations that we've had with ECCC on that topic, perhaps.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, we're seeing a lot of questions about which methodologies could be used under TIER and as well under GHGRP and SGRR. So based on conversations that we have with ECCC is that all of the methodologies that we have prescribed in Chapter 15 may be used by all conventional oil and gas facilities, regardless of whether you are over or under that 10,000 ton threshold, which is the reporting threshold for GHGRP. Our understanding is that ECCC is phasing in certain requirements, such as sampling requirements, based on the sector that the facility is in. So right now, the conventional oil and gas facilities are not, as I understand, considered to be part of that expansion facility list, and therefore they are not subject to the same sampling frequencies that are prescribed in GHGRP. Having said that, we do recommend that facilities do evaluate whether they meet any additional sampling requirements with ECCC, as we can't speak for them in terms of the requirements that they have there. So for now, our understanding is that the methodologies that we have prescribed in Chapter 15 would be permitted for facilities for any emissions levels.
Thanks, Maggie. Okay, another question here. If operators want to adjust the Petronex fuel gas data down because they know that some of the fuel was vented in pneumatic equipment, does that require a deviation request? And so I would say yes, that would require a deviation request. Please comment on drilling and completion stationary combustion, and is the trucking component to be included? So I think we have a reasonable level of clarity in the AQM that drilling and completion emissions should be included in the stationary fuel combustion category. In terms of trucking, like again, we're only looking at emissions that occur within the boundary of the conventional oil and gas facility. So, I mean, I think if you're talking about the movement of a drill rig from one place to another place within the conventional oil and gas site, I'm thinking that fuel used to do that transition from one site to another is de minimis, and it's probably just as well to include that with your stationary fuel combustion. If you're talking about the transport of drill rig or completion equipment from site to site on the highways, that's outside the boundary of the conventional oil and gas facility and ought not to be in. Okay, to further the question on the fact the verifier is required to evaluate if emissions report are consistent with criteria specified under GHGRP. Okay, I guess we have this one. Okay. If a company changes the flow of gas and it moves from one cog to another, Petronex battery IDs, do we need to submit those changes to the aggregate and have the tier ID updated? So maybe I'm not fully understanding this question, but the aggregate is a composition of a certain number of conventional oil and gas facilities, and typically includes also you know, the set of corresponding Petronex facility IDs. So if there are new sites to be added to the aggregate, that is something that should be done. If those sites aren't in tier, that can be done through the course of the year, and we have a form for that. If you're talking about a change of gas within the aggregate, I guess there is potential for that to affect the benchmark depending which benchmark units you're using. And so again, that would kind of fall back to our previous answer that we're looking at thresholds, where we would have to potentially re-examine the benchmarks for facilities if there's been a significant kind of structural change to the aggregate. Hopefully that answers the question. If not, maybe send us an email. Will fuel used by third-party drilling companies be required to be reported within the COG? If your response included comment on the in your response include comment on the federal fuel charge paid, not paid. So like for what we've done, I guess maybe I'll start there. So for the regulation in our definition of direct emissions, we've excluded emissions from fuel where the federal fuel charge has been paid during a time when the exemption certificate was in place. So just as an example, if somebody's using a 2020 same year benchmark and they've the third party has paid the federal fuel charge on all the fuels that were used, and the aggregate had an exemption certificate in place for the full year, then those fuels shouldn't be reported for 2020. We assume that in the longer term, people will be working and setting up processes so that their exemption certificate will apply when people are doing drilling and completion activities in their aggregates. So the expectation is that over the longer term, the intent of the aggregates will be for them to either purchase the fuel themselves under their exemption certificate and make that a fuel available to the third parties, or to work with them in some other way to make the exemption certificate applicable, because presumably those costs are significant. So in those cases, basically those fuels would become exempted from the federal fuel charge and would therefore be reported as part of tier. So hopefully that's helpful. So question, may I assume that if emissions are zero and production is zero, these COGs do not need to be listed in B1 or B6 respectively? I think that's fine. I think there's also no harm in listing them. It certainly makes it a little bit easier as a verifier if all the sites are listed to confirm completeness, and that's a little bit helpful for us. But in either case, we're likely to be cross-referencing that with the Petronex data in any case. For aggregate, is there a tab to report a difference between baseline COGS and compliance COGS, COGS that were bought and sold, etc.? Okay, so excellent question. Just having a quick look, I think we usually have a tab in our forms that has a large comment space, but I think maybe I have to set that question aside and come back to it. If there isn't a sheet in our current form that has a free-form text box where you can include that, then please do just send along with your compliance report an additional attachment with that information. The compliance reporting form has numerous columns of off-sheet calculations based on fixed factors and conversions. Why is this machine work not relegated to the workbook? I'm not sure I understand the question. So it's correct that people will have to calculate their emissions and enter it into the book. That's, I guess, not included currently in the workbook, I guess, if that's the question. What would be acceptable correlation stated above if there is not an acceptable correlation using a predetermined metrics, production, disposition, receipts, who will be contacting the person? So in terms of acceptable correlation, I think currently we're looking at probably a threshold of a R-squared value of about 0.6. We're still looking through the applications and the data that we've received, but it looks like that's probably going to be a good breakpoint for us. Okay. Are you required to revoke an aggregate facility if you want to transfer it into the opt-in program? So probably not. I think if I recall correctly, the way the regulation is worded, the fact that you apply for an opt-in would automatically remove you from the aggregate. But certainly, if you're intending to do that, please do make a note for us that the site is currently in an aggregate, so we can make sure to do that removal. How quickly are you responding to the emails in the GHG email address? I've submitted a critical question 2 weeks ago and have not heard a response. So please submit that again. I would say typically we're responding within 2 or 3 days. But if you have something that's burning and you haven't received a response, please send it in to us again. Could you please repeat your answer for the question about CS fuel use? I'm not sure if that was about the fuel use where the federal fuel charges has been paid. Again, we've deducted that from the direct emissions during a period where you have exemption certificate in place. Hopefully that helps. As a follow-up for aggregates, that the government is calculating the benchmark drilling completions not included. If the compliance report includes drilling and completions, the benchmark would not be representative. Operators may appear to be owing, which is not necessarily the case. So again, I think I might have answered this question already, but the benchmarks that the government is setting at this point are of two kinds. So one kind is on the request of aggregates based on their 2019 benchmark application, in which case, presumably, the aggregates are in a good position to include their drilling and completion. The other kind of benchmark that we're setting at this point is the same year 2020 benchmark, where the compliance reporting for 2020 also forms the benchmark. And so in that case, both the benchmark and the compliance reporting will either have the drilling and completion emissions or not, based on the reporting by the aggregate. So I think the ball's kind of in the court of the aggregates for the drilling and completion emissions at this point. Okay. If you combine multiple tier aggregates in 2020 or 2021, will you be required to re-baseline? If it's a simple combination of aggregates, I think the department will probably be in a good position to do the re-benchmarking for you. I'm not sure there'll be any additional data required from the aggregates in that kind of situation. When the recording of this video will be available, I missed the answer to my question. It'll probably, to be honest, take the better part of a week actually to get our web posting done for these videos. So if the answer to your question was burning, please submit it to our AEP GHG box. What is required to be reported as Petronex volume for compressor stations in the form? 0, or get the fuel volume from the to from column in the Petronex facility activity report. So this is similar to another question we had before, where there was a suggestion there was a misalignment with the Petronex reporting and the facility boundary. So, I mean, I think happy to take that offline for a deeper conversation. I mean, my temptation would be to kind of look to the definitions of the reg and be fairly comprehensive in the emissions reporting. So, like if you have fuels which aren't reported in Petronex for that facility, I would be suggesting to draw those in if you need to through the fields we have for that purpose for fuels that aren't reported in Petronex. Okay, so question about verifiers, I think. Do the verifiers need to visit my wells? They can just come into the office where the data is handled. So I believe what we had said is that the approach to visiting sites is up to the verifier. We've given some guidance there, and I think Maggie also mentioned that we have enabled virtual site visits for this year with respect to COVID. So there shouldn't be a need for somebody to physically go to your facility for this compliance year for certain. If the coordinates change from the application to the compliance report, is a justification required or just a notice? I don't believe we've asked for the coordinates in the compliance reporting. So, so if there has been some change or a correction required, please do send us a notice if your latitude and longitude weren't correctly recorded in your aggregate application. Oh, okay, that question come twice maybe. Do we have to use method 6 if a facility within the aggregate reports into the GHGRP? So I think Maggie took a run at that one. Like from our understanding with the folks from ECCC, all the methods that we've put forward as options for aggregates under tier would meet the GHGRP requirements. Are you able to elaborate on the statement, same methodology must be used for each conventional oil and gas facility? Does this mean that if I want to use method 15.2 at a conventional oil and gas facility, that specific cog must only have more than one stream of fuel? Or am I able to split my aggregate into 2 groups of cogs and say that this group of cogs uses fuel from one source and the other group use fuel from another source? So what we're meaning is that the same methodology is used within a single conventional oil and gas facility. So you could have selected a variety of the methodology that we've made as options across the aggregate, but within a single site at the aggregate, we're looking for one methodology to be used. Hopefully that helps. Okay. SGR reporting deadline is June 1st, while the tier reporting is June 30th. Will there be a realignment? So I think we're looking potentially in future for there to be a realignment. Again, this is a good discussion to have with the sector. I mean, putting everything on the same day, I don't know if that makes people's lives easier or harder. Certainly the intention is to move where we can towards a single reporting of greenhouse gas emissions. As you know, we're not there yet, but that is the longer term goal for certain. Further to the ABCS question. If operator A is the operator of record reporting in Petronex, the ABCS under an operator ABGS, but operator B is the facility operator, could operator A or operator B include this facility in their aggregate? From the tier aggregate list submitted, it appears that operator B should be the person responsible. However, operator B does not report this facility to Petronex and could not easily obtain the fuel volumes reported. So what we're looking for is the operator of record under Petronex as the person responsible. And so that's in the definition of person responsible under the regulation. So maybe I could suggest having a look there. Okay, just let me take a quick scan. I think I accidentally dismissed the question here. Okay. Okay. Maybe that was the one that I missed. Okay. Is the quarterly sampling required for SGRR calculations reporting facilities with over 10 kilotons of CO2e? So I guess same answer as the GHGRP question. So for the single window reporting purposes for SGRR and for the GHGRP program, any of the methods that are available for the aggregates are fine. Does a benchmark report provide indicators to the status of fugitive emissions in the facility? So no, the scope for aggregates doesn't include fugitives. It's limited to stationary fuel combustion. Maggie, I don't know if you've seen, we've got a couple of questions remaining about the form and the combination of method 15.1 with methods 15.6 and 15.7 in terms of the alignment that the form is enforcing on the methods consistency. We could take that offline, or I just wondered if you knew offhand.
I don't know offhand, but yeah, we can definitely take that offline and take a look and get back to the individual there.
Okay. We've got a couple more questions. Currently, tier determines reporting responsibility based on the operator of record at the start of the year, while every other reporting program determines reporting responsibilities based on the end of the year operatorship. Are there any plans to shift the tier's date to align with other reporting programs? So the reason for that is that at the beginning of the year, you have an aggregate and a single reporter. And again, our compliance unit really is that aggregate. At the end of the year, that aggregate may have, could easily have 3 or 4 different operators of different parts of that aggregate. So it's not really, if we look at the end of the year, there's not necessarily a unique party that is necessarily identifiable for that collection, because that collection may no longer I guess, be a collection in the same sense. So that's a large part of the reason that we're working off the beginning of the year in tier, because it is an annual system, and we're looking for an identifiable party. But it's a good question, and it's something that for sure we're going to probably reflect on as we get to the regulatory review period and have had a little bit more experience with the sector under the program. Okay, another question on GHGRPs. Sorry, you probably answered this, but do the GHGRP and tier reporting need to match? We would expect that in a lot of cases they'll be matching or very close. I mean, there is a little bit of a difference, like we've identified in terms of, for example, treatment of those fuels where the federal fuel charge has already been paid. Like because we're a pricing system, we kind of put a bit of a priority in terms of coherence of the pricing approach, whereas those emissions, would typically have to be reported under the GHGRP. So some items like that might cause a bit of a difference. And of course, again, if we're talking just about aggregates, the emissions scope is quite different between the GHGRP and the tier aggregate system. Okay, well, it looks like we're tailing off a little bit on questions. Happy to spend a few more minutes on that. Like that's a good part of the purpose for our session today. So if people do have more questions, feel free to put them out there now, or if you prefer, or it's a very unique situation. Again, as Peter said, feel free to email us at AEP GHG. So we'll maybe wait a couple minutes to see if anyone has any more questions. So we've got one more question in, I guess. Is there a possibility that indirect emissions will be included in the aggregate in the future? So like the only way that I could answer that question would be yes, I guess. Like that's possible. One of the things that we'll have to evaluate a little bit over time is the whether the inclusion of indirects, for example, would help with some of the instances maybe where we see that we have poor correlations between emissions and production. It could be that inclusion of indirects in some of those cases help with that. But there's no immediate plans to make any change there. Okay, so what is the threshold for having to reestablish your baseline if you add or remove facilities in the next reporting year? So I think we haven't landed on a hard and fast rule there. I guess I had speculated before it might be something on the order of 2 or 3% of the benchmark intensity in terms of the impact of such a change. But I don't think we've landed on that. I think we do have the ability, probably with the data that we collect, to respond to that without too much effort in terms of the aggregates themselves. But we'll be working probably as we get a little bit more experience with the degrees of change, and we have a few more benchmarks actually established. We'll probably be working towards solidifying that kind of threshold. Okay, another question. Will the changing of QMs be allowed from year to year, and is there a process in place? So I am going to interpret this as a change in the the choice of the methodologies that are used for the aggregate rather than an update in our quantification methodologies. I mean, I think generally our quantification methodologies probably will update a little bit from year to year. In terms of a change in the choice of methods, probably that will be supported, but it may require a piece of work to redo benchmarking if you're changing the methodologies. For new aggregates that have a benchmark due September 1st, we will have to wait until the benchmark period has been established in April, correct? Yeah, that's true. And I mean, I guess depending on what happens with that April decision about how the benchmark period will be set, it could be we might need data, or we might not, from other non-new aggregates before September 1st. But. Okay. Well, maybe I'll suggest we can draw to a close then today. We seem to have gotten through at least the burning questions that people had for us today, so that's good. Peter, do you want to close us out?
Sure. Yeah, I guess I just reiterate, kind of any follow-up questions, please do send them into the aap.ghc inbox. Thank you everyone for taking the time to attend today, and yeah, we'll talk soon, I'm sure, and there'll be some further communications in April. Thanks everyone, and have a great weekend.